All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Mercy Julian and I am accompanied by the ELAN Executive Committee. If you are on camera, give it a wave. Who has made today's event possible through brilliant collaborative efforts. Brian Weischer will guide our panelists and Degmo Getty will monitor the chat discussions. Today we're gathered on this beautiful Sunday afternoon to discuss alternatives to the class novel, including texts that are culturally responsive and trauma-informed. This panel is in response to a need for moving beyond the class novels, but still addressing curriculum through thematic short stories units of studies that encourage student selection of texts too. This ensures that students have access to all kinds of reading that reflects who they are, who and what they want to be, and their lived experiences, instilling a joy of reading rather than making reading a requirement or chore. Our panelists come with a variety of approaches and reasons for this practice, and we are privileged to be able to learn from them. And we encourage you to reflect on your own practice and think about where you are in terms of the text that you are reading with your students. My name is Mercy, and I'm a teacher and a parent in Toronto, Ontario. I affirm that I am a visitor on the colonized lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Chippewa bands, recognizing and honoring the Williams Treaty, also known as Treaty 13, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands, Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples. I recognize and value the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Finally, I acknowledge Takaronto is built on sacred land that is part of an agreement between Indigenous peoples and then extended to allied nations to peacefully and respectfully care for it. By personally making a land acknowledgement, I am taking part in the act of reconciliation, honoring this land and its Indigenous heritage, which dates back over 10,000 years.
I don't think there is a bigger voice in helping us understand a path forward as there was in Lee Maracle. And I just wanted to take a moment to recognize the loss that we are experiencing when she passed away just recently. She was a writer, thinker, and educator from the Stolo Nation who inspired many, including Indigenous writers, who cite Maracle as a force that helped them find their own voices. As educators, we are fortunate that her work and words, including my conversations with Canadians, remain with us as a guide and as an inspiration and as a testament to what's possible. I want to add to Mercy's welcome. I'm so pleased that all of you could join us on a Sunday afternoon to engage in talking about a different way, a novel approach. And so I just want to mention a few things before we get into our panel discussion today. First of all, you may have noticed that we are recording this session. We will make this recording available on our ELAN site. Mercy's going to talk about our site at the end of the session today, but it will be available in the members section. So you can find that recording there for those who may have missed it, or if you want to come back and view it again. Today, we're really going to focus on three questions: the what, the why, and the how. And it's through these questions that our panelists are going to share their expertise, their wisdom, and their insights. So they're going to let us know, what does their alternative to the whole class novel look like? Why did they take this approach? And how do they incorporate assessment with this approach? While that's happening, Degmo is going to just talk about your role and your participation in this as well. So Degmo, I'll pass it to you.
I'm sorry, I just realized that I'm muted. Oh my
No
goodness,
worries.
thank you. No worries. Thank you so much. You can, this is a learning opportunity for everyone. Please feel free to use the chat if you have any questions. And you can also put your any comments, any questions in the Twitter account. Thank you so much.
And just to note about your contributions to chat and Twitter, and as Degmo said, you're welcome to engage in sharing that. We aren't going to have a question and answer part of our session today. And although we don't want to discourage you from sharing the questions that we have, we really don't think we have enough time to address them specifically. But if you want to post some questions, we're going to save the chat, and certainly we can look at those questions as ways to provide further opportunities around this topic. So let's get to why we're all here, and that's to hear from our panelists. I think we are in for a wonderful session this afternoon, and it's really about the panelists who have so graciously offered to share their expertise today. These are teachers who decided to disrupt the convention of selecting one novel for one class, be it 25, 30 or more students, have them all read it at the same time and the same pace, and then go forward with the expectation or the hope that every one of those students have the understanding, the love, and the appreciation as much as we do. And now I realize that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but I don't think that's very far from my early practice when I brought that one novel to a group of kids and said, okay, let's read. So whether you've already moved away from a whole class novel and you want to gain some insights from other educators who are trying this out, or you're thinking about shaking things up about your approach and how you instill the love of reading for your students, I think we will all learn a great deal from our panelists today. So I just want to welcome Amanda Gonzalez from the Halton Catholic District School Board, Casey Hackett from the Durham District School Board, Daniel Begg from the Ottawa Catholic District School Board, George Janateas from the Toronto District School Board, and Olivia Pellegrino from the Halton Catholic District School Board. Welcome, panelists. And again, thanks for being so generous for with your time and your expertise today. So we are going to move to our first question. What does that alternative to the whole class novel look like? And Amanda, we're gonna get started with you. And Amanda, please feel free to share a little bit about yourself before you address that question if you like. So Amanda, I'll let you get started.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So my name is Amanda Gonzalez. I am an English teacher and department head of English Moderns and ESL at St. Francis Xavier. And my experience with the alternative to the novel has been happening for the last few years. So when I first kind of shook things up or disrupted the way that we teach our classic novel study, it was through offering a variety of novels, right? And kind of thinking about lit circles. And part of the reason that I did that was actually because of accessibility. We have a really big school. At one point, we had over 600 grade 9s, which is a lot, right? A lot of sections of grade 9, and just running one book per course it was impossible. We didn't have enough books. And so your classic kind of lit circle really kind of helped and really was able to get the kids to buy in with that novel selection. But what I'd like to talk about, not only just because of accessibility, in the last year with the pandemic, I think it's forced a lot of us to adapt the way that we teach. And one of the things in terms of my experience at my school is that kids just weren't able to get the text, whether it's because they couldn't come into the school or they didn't have access to electronic copies of text. We had to get kind of creative with how we decided we were going to actually deliver our curriculum. And the wonderful thing about, English and language curriculum is that it is all skill-based. And so a lot of what we were able to do to meet the needs and the overall expectations of the curriculum, we were able to do without an actual novel. And I know people might be thinking like, oh my gosh, you're teaching without a novel. Like what kind of English program are you running? What is this? But please, like, believe me, it's definitely possible. And it's, again, that adaptation, right? We can still meet the needs of reading expectations and still meet literacy expectations by using media other than a novel. So things like a variety of texts, right? Thinking about short stories. And what it was really able, or what we were really able to accomplish is not only meeting the needs of the curriculum, but also getting students to buy in. We think about young people, in the age of TikTok, where we're getting information, at 30, 40 seconds at a time, a minute at a time. Reading is not unlike that for these kids. They're used to kind of getting these fragments of information, like 140 characters or less. So for those learners who reject novels altogether just because of the sheer size of them, reading short stories was a little bit more digestible. And, it's not to say that they were reading any less, right, than a whole novel. It's just in those kind of more digestible snippets, it allowed students to kind of buy in more. And so it's been an interesting experience, to say the least. I think, just the idea of straying away from that full novel was a little daunting at first, but I was able to get kind of buy-in from my department, and we found great success with it. And even this year, now that we're back in the classroom and we have a little bit more accessibility with books, a lot of teachers are starting to really change the way they're teaching and changing their approach, and looking at even things like part of a novel instead of even the full novel. So it's been really, really interesting, but so far, so good.
Thanks, Amanda. I mean, and one of the things that you're pointing out is that a novel is not in our curriculum expectations. Like, again, it's not specified there. So we have a whole range of possibilities that I think you're just inviting us to take on. So thanks for that. Okay, thanks for getting us started, Amanda. We're going to now move to Casey. And Casey, I know in the lead up to doing some preparations, I think some of the things that you're doing might overlap with what Amanda talked about, but you also had some other ways that you were doing this approach. So I'll invite you again, if you want to share a little bit more about your background, and then let us know what your approach has been.
All right, thanks, Brian. I'm happy to be here as well. I'm Casey Hackett, and I am an English teacher and department head at GL Roberts CVI in Oshawa in the Durham District School Board. And yeah, so in my classroom, actually, we've been doing literature circles at our school for quite a long time. So we started in grade 9, so over a decade ago. We actually moved away from whole class novels, and then gradually after that at all grades and levels. And recently in my classroom, I try and make reading sort of one thing I've moved away from is the idea of like the novel as like a unit. So reading is more of an ongoing event where we switch up what that looks like. And so I had taken some stuff from Penny Kittle and Kelly Gallagher from their book 180 Days. And that was really where I first the wheels started turning about, looking at a reading curriculum that extends throughout the whole course, that it's something that students are doing on a regular basis. And so I tend to start with self-selected reading. So over the last few years, I've built up my classroom library to include all different types of texts. So lots of YA novels, graphic texts, novels in verse, and also different target audiences as well for different grade levels and that type of thing, including audiobooks and that as well. And what I found with the self-selected reading and starting with that on a regular basis every day is it really gives me an opportunity to get to know my students as readers. Whereas sometimes when we only do that within a unit, you know, it's only so much time and then it's over. So seeing what types of books they gravitate to, seeing their enthusiasm or lack thereof for gravitating towards books, what their reading stamina is like in the beginning, without that sort of evaluative gaze hanging over them. And so I find it really gives me an opportunity to get to know them and their reading behaviors. And we work on some goal setting, some personal goal setting, and I can do some initial assessments. And then we tend to move into lit circles after that. And by that time, I have a whole bunch of information about them as readers to be able to support them, you know, once they get to lit circles and they've built a few skills to use with their groups. And then I tend to go back to the self-selected towards the end of the course. And it's really wonderful to sometimes see their growth. And like Amanda said, you know, sometimes, you know, after a couple of weeks, you just see that students aren't latching on to books. So I might direct them to things like, you know, collections where they can access shorter texts, or even I had some students last quad who gravitated towards some, you know, we looked at some podcasts and that type of thing. So really just kind of getting them that regular reading practice or listening or engaging with all different types of text going. So I think it's really about letting go of some of that control to of our own role as sort of director of reading experiences and walking alongside young readers as well, and teaching those kids as opposed to, you know, teaching the book. And it's never a perfect process. And I know for some people letting go of that control is hard, but it can be really rewarding in the end as well.
Thanks, Casey. Your mention of Kelly Gallagher and Penny Kittle, again, who have been really influential in getting us to rethink how we do the novel. But I also know that you've been a recipient of their book program. So congratulations on that. I know that's some work to do to actually apply for that. So congratulations for adding to your classroom library through their program. So great, thanks for that. As we continue on, just a reminder, you are welcome to be commenting in the chat some ideas as well on Twitter. And again, if you want to use the hashtag #ELANReads to kind of bring that conversation together, you are welcome to do that. Let's now turn to Daniel Begg. So welcome, Dan, and please feel free to let us know a little bit about your background and then let us know about your approach to alternative to the whole class novel.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. As Brian mentioned, my name is Daniel Begg, and I'm a teacher with the Ottawa Catholic School Board, high school English specifically. Lately in my board, the last few years, we've been really pushing to change up the text we read in class, moving away from predominantly white male authors into more diverse backgrounds, which is obviously overdue, but is also something that we are making progress on regularly. And that's really what my kind of approach, my project is all based on, is giving voice to more diverse backgrounds, giving voice to authors from a range of societal and cultural backgrounds and levels, essentially. And the first thing I want to say about it is that it's very much a work in progress. I just finished teaching it for the first time. So if there's any gaps in what I say, if something doesn't make sense, that is probably why. So at its core, the project, which myself and my coworker entitled Expressions and Oppression, is us replacing more traditionally studied English texts with those written by authors from, as I mentioned, a more diverse spectrum. And the point of this is to understand more various histories and systems of oppression running through the past all the way up to our present, and how they continue to affect us, our society, and our students' lives to this day. So initially, I did plan for this to be a single unit, but it kind of ended up stretching out and blowing up a little bit into a bit more of a thematic focus for the entire grade 12 university English course. And it was a theme which I ended up presenting to my students as question your answers. Essentially, think about the systems in place around you, the beliefs that you hold, and try to understand why those exist, why they are just accepted at the moment, and why they aren't challenged in any way. So the first kind of core unit we studied, so to speak, was predominantly nonfiction. So writings and videos that helped develop an understanding of these histories from my students. So we began on the first day with reading James Baldwin's essay, A Talk to Teachers. And this gave my students a chance to critically re-examine their own educational careers, understanding why they got to where they are, understanding what worked and what didn't, and trying to assess why education exists the way it does and why it hasn't changed more. We moved through writings by Ibram X. Kendi, a TED Talk from Chimamanda Adichie. We watched Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th, and we eventually ended up at an article from Atlantic journalist Adam Serwer titled The Cruelty is the Point. And what all of these had in common, and what all of them sort of developed, is my students' understanding of the real world implications caused by these historic systems of oppression and intolerance. And that led us then to explore more relevant issues. In the fall, that meant the Texas abortion ban, which had just passed, and trying to deconstruct how that was just really a step in our societal shift, really an ongoing pattern of control and manipulation by the powers that be over time. So all of that we explored through a few different lenses, from Marxist to structuralist, post-colonial, and this really helped us expand across the course as a whole to looking at these critical lenses in a bunch of different ways. So after that, we moved into a whole class study, which I know is not ideal, but our school is moving a bit more slowly, but we're trying to move away from that, of Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, and critically the American dream and the inequality present within it. We looked at Canadian writer Alistair MacLeod and his novel No Great Mischief to explore histories of trauma and how intergenerational trauma plays a role in people's lives up to the present, and how it's impossible, or very difficult at least, to escape those systems and those cycles. And all of that was to show that although a lot of these issues are racial and they originate very much in our Western world, they're also colonial, and they come out of the colonial exploitation of various peoples around the world throughout time. Finally, what we ended up with in the course was my initial idea, essentially literature circles, which are not groundbreaking, I know, but they looked at nonfiction texts from authors from a more diverse cultural and historic background. So what the literature circles were geared towards really was allowing my students to deconstruct one of 4 texts through the lenses of everything we studied. So we again looked at James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. We read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the Roads and Me, Jesmyn Ward's Men We Reaped, and Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family. And all of these did give that firsthand non-fictional account of histories of oppression, whether they were overt or implied. And then what bookended this unit and the course as a whole was a final project wherein my students were paired with a student from another circle and had to essentially teach their peer about their novel. The two then collectively analyzed the 2 books, what was similar, what was different, how these sort of critical analyses were completed, and then tried to contextualize those differences based on the societal, cultural, and political backgrounds impacting each author. So they shared these projects with their peers, they had Socratic seminars to discuss them, and it essentially allowed my students to understand more than just the one book. There was that choice of which novel to read, but they were also able to learn about another classmate's novel and then participate in discussion surrounding the other 2.
Thanks,
Greg.
Daniel. And I think I need to go back to the recording just to write down all of the texts that you have shared. And I love that in those texts too, like getting at that culturally responsive and relevant text for kids, that hopefully that diversity where students are being able to see themselves and see others through those texts. And I think that's one of the things why we ask students to read. It's just a way to understand the world and about themselves. So thanks for sharing those. The other thing that I'd like to point out on is where Casey and her staff might be on a different place, working on this approach for a number of years, and you're getting started. And I think it's great to hear that we're all in different places in addition to the different kinds of approaches that we take. So thanks for sharing that. We will move now to talk to George. So George, thanks for being here. Again, if you want to share a little bit about your background and then let us know what your approach is to not doing a whole class novel.
Hey everyone, I'm George Janateus. I am the ACL of Drama, English, and Literacy at Melbourne Collegiate. I'm also one of the hybrid teachers for the Digital Lead Learner program in the TESB. So we look at ways that we can leverage technology and digital tools and use them purposefully in the classroom. So that's been a really exciting new thing that I get to be a part of. So at Malvern, we have made a ton of changes. One of them includes self-selected reading that Casey talked about. So that's something that happens throughout the courses, in all of the courses. And we've moved away from a novel study as pretty much in all of the classes and gone towards book clubs. I used to do literature circles, but I struggled with it because I felt like sometimes depending on the roles that we created, it didn't really work that well. And that's something that we really struggled with. So we looked at, first of all, changing the books. And that was in consultation with our stakeholders, our students, parents and caregivers, colleagues. They all helped to inform the books that we chose. And so that was a really, really cool thing. And then we also have a culturally relevant and responsive checklist that the TDSB's equity department has put together. So that also gave us some guidelines in terms of choosing texts and how we proceed with what texts we use in the classroom. In terms of book clubs that are different from literature circles, I see it a question in the chat. The way that I organized it is that each day has a very specific kind of task. So Monday is really an opportunity for students to get together informally and just share their thoughts, questions, and epiphanies based on their agreed upon reading schedule. So they decide how many pages they need to have read at that certain point. And then they will do like a big paper activity and we just capture each other's thinking as we're chatting. And that's going to help inform the future activities. So we go into looking at important passages, then we move on in the next day, specifically looking at craft and craft moves, and we start to pull apart all those beautiful sentences and passages. And then we're actually working on creating a wall of them using Padlet. So it's going to be half digital and then half in the classroom so that we have access to all the different passages that we have found to be beautiful. We're looking at specific craft moves. And then on Wednesday, we actually hone in on critical literacies. So this is where we actually spend a lot of time unpacking power and privilege, oppression, democracy, justice, tolerance. And we actually look at specific questions through topic journals and through discussions. So there are different prompt cards that students are working with. And then in grade 11 and 12, we do that same thing, but we also look at critical lenses as well and looking at theory and criticisms. And then Thursday, what I'm starting to pilot now, and I've seen it's been very, very popular on Twitter, so I had to kind of give it a whirl, is that hexagonal thinking. And so we're collecting terms, ideas, characters, other literary elements, other connections. We start to look at the relationships and connections between these concepts and ideas. So students will make their own individually, and then they'll compare with their group members how each of those hexagonal thinking patterns look, and then talk about why theirs looks a certain way or what they noticed as they were reading. And then we move into Friday, where we work on some media production stuff. So my 11s right now are working on film adaptations and what that could look like based on their novels. And then we also do a thing where students will meet other book club groups. So they'll get an opportunity to do book talks and share what their book is about. But really, we're looking at common themes. Like, how does this book approach this particular theme in comparison to my book? And so now we're getting new perspectives, new ideas, and new ways to go back and reflect on our own reading and say, based on that conversation I had with my peer who's reading this book, it got me thinking about my book in a little bit differently now. So it's not just conversations that are happening with those who are reading the same text. There are also conversations happening with those who are reading different texts. And so we're getting that broad perspective, that holistic understanding. And all of this stuff is housed in 3 units: affirming identity. So we're starting with stories of joy. Then we go into recognizing injustice and then taking action. So all of this work eventually will turn into something that becomes action oriented in our course.
Thanks so much, George. You mentioned sort of your evolution from literature circles, and even Harvey Daniels, who might claim to have pioneered literature circles, I'm not sure, but talks about how sometimes those roles became artificial. And I love how maybe maybe that was the challenge that you were experiencing with literature circles that helped you transform to those book clubs. And thanks for that distinction about what those book clubs look like. So thanks. Let's now move to talk to Olivia. Olivia, we're so glad that you could be part of the panel as well, because you bring a bit of a different perspective in that you are a grade 7-8 teachers. And part of our work in ELAN is to support teachers from 7 to 12. And so we're so glad that you can bring your perspective of what that looks like with your students. So again, welcome. If you just want to give us a little bit more information about your background, and then if you want to tell us about your approach.
Awesome, thank you. As everyone has said, I'm really happy to be here today, really excited, and everything that's been said so far is super brilliant. So thank you all for sharing. So my name is Olivia. Hi, I'm in the Halton Catholic District School Board. And as Brian said, I am in the elementary panel. I'm currently teaching a self-contained grade 7-8 gifted class. And I transitioned into that role after a few years in secondary. And it's a super fun role. And that's sort of where my approach is coming from. It's about fun. So a lot of the curriculum that I've been developing in language over the last couple of years has focused on a love of reading and this belief that everybody has the capacity to love reading. Sometimes that love just needs to be ignited or reignited. And so one of the approaches that I kind of discovered by accident is gamification. And that's something that I've brought into my classroom over the past couple of years, starting in STEM, in sciences. And then I thought, how can I fold these principles into language as well? And so, I wanted to apply the principles of fun, the principles of gamification to the reading classroom. And, gamification is this process where we implement the principles of gaming, right? Like video games, computer games, into non-gaming contexts. And some of the research that I've done on the approach, it talks about how since gaming is in and of itself often voluntary and social and collaborative and competitive, it sort of creates this context for self-direction and for fun learning in the classroom. And that's certainly been my experience. So some of the principles that I've tried to fold into my instruction is the idea that games involve mechanics or rules, and they have progression. So in reading, I wanted my students to have challenges that had clear rules and clear expectations set forward. So one of the things that I do is a reading challenge. There are 10 prompts that I put up in the classroom at the beginning of the year, one for each month of the school year. And to win the challenge, students have to complete 10 pieces of reading, self-selected reading from different genres, according to the prompts, right? So some of them are like a book by an author you've never read before, or a book you chose because of the cover, or a piece that's been translated from another language, a poem. And the prompts change every year, just to keep things interesting, because teaching 7-8, I usually have repeat students, so I got to keep things fresh. Games also involve leveling up. So we keep a progression chart in the classroom, and there are rewards for every book that gets completed. In 7-8, candy still works really well, and stickers still work really well, but extra gym time, an extra week of leading the care of our classroom garden, or an extra period of doing something that the student loves works as a really great motivator to keep climbing that ladder to get to the end of the challenge. And sometimes students will go like super quickly through it. So I have students who are already done their January book, and I have students who are still working on their October book, and that's totally fine. We recognize that everyone reads and works at a different pace. And the point of it is to have fun and then reach your goal eventually. So finish that game by the end of the school year. good games, right, are also dynamic. They need to change based on player behavior. And so not every child reads in the same way. Activities need to be designed so that all players can start in the same place, right? So the reading challenge starts where nobody's read anything. And then based on their decisions, the game is different for them. So what they read is different for them, right? So I have students who are reading manga, I have students who are reading newspapers, and students who are listening to audiobooks, and all of that counts, right? Because it's all about that sustained love of reading, which is the last part of game theory. It involves the player's state of mind, right? The emotional experience of the game. And that was the easiest part of gamification for me to figure out. The goal was to get the students to love reading, to enjoy reading, to have positive emotions surrounding that. And it's really a testament that it's working. In my room, I have students who are helping one another make choices for their next book. They're asking if they can read during their self-directed time, even if it means they need an extra day for their art project. And like, yes, absolutely, yes, 100%. So it's something that I'm still working through, but so far the fun has really proven to be groundbreaking and exciting in my room.
Thanks so much, Olivia. And one of the things that I'm hearing is how all of that can really meet students where they are, who they are. Like the fact that we've got these adolescent learners and you are tapping into some of those needs that they have. And that idea about reading as being about joy and joyful and pulling those in. So thanks for sharing all of those things. One of the things that you noted, Olivia, too, was about the stickers. And my experience tells me that the stickers work in grade 12. And I think Michelle Westerman in the chat also noted that those kinds of things are effective elsewhere besides grade 7 and 8 classes. Okay, wow. I feel like I've gained so much just from our first question. And Degmo, I'd like to turn it over to you. Just you've been sort of checking into the chat, checking into possibly Twitter. Are there things that are coming up that you want to make note of?
Oh my goodness, a lot has come up recently. Well, just to summarize, the comments in chat, a lot of people have said that they love the idea of giving students choice in relation to text. Right, choice is important, and also giving them choice in how they can show their learning. But George was so quick in answering that question about what's the difference between book clubs and literature circles. And some people have noted that, what turns them off with literature circles, it's so artificial and having elements. And also, with a hybrid model, you have students coming in virtually in the classroom, and then some of them are in the classroom. And how do you have that collaboration work? Absenteeism is another issue, right? If anybody would like to talk about this, how can we make it work when we have some of these challenges in play?
I like too some of the things that came up were when we're thinking about the alternative to the whole class novel. Sometimes that alternative is about the selections that we can provide around different novels with diverse voices that speak to the brilliance, joy, and resilience of characters from all kinds of backgrounds that we might learn from. But it's also about the choices that we can make that are not about the novel. And again, I think George and Olivia talked about that it doesn't necessarily have to be the novel. And I think Amanda also started off that as well. And the fact that, whatever criticism that we might be sharing around literature circles, I mean, for myself, it was a place to start. And so again, as a way to move from the whole class novel, at least that practice was better than the former practice that I was using. Anyway, let's get back to our panelists again, and let's get to the second question. One of the things that we talked about in our collaboration and that we thought would be interesting, not just what each of these educators do, but why they're doing it. What was the reasons that grounded their shift in practice? And for this round, George, I'm going to ask you to get us started off to talk about what were your reasons why you decided to move in your practice. And you've actually talked about a couple moves that you did after that. So anyway, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I moved from the novel study to Lit Circles to book clubs. And I think part of it is because I felt like Lit Circles was a really good job to teach cooperation, but not collaboration. So I understand cooperation to be, you all need to work together to fulfill an individual goal, whereas collaboration is you're actually working together to achieve a common purpose. And my work was really centered around how could I honor and foster collaboration in the classroom in a real, authentic way and in a meaningful way. So they're all working towards this one common goal. And because the other piece too is, especially now, given the last couple of years, I feel like collaboration needs to be at the heart of the approach, and also around relationship building. One thing I ask my students at the beginning of the book clubs is, do you think you can get to know somebody just by talking about your reading? Or how much do you think you can get to know somebody by simply talking about your reading? And so part of what's built into this is, what did you learn about your peer when you had this conversation today? Not about the book, but about your peer. And especially in a grade 9 class, when it is a transition year, what you really want to do more than anything else is help build relationships and help build new friendships. And that can totally be done through book clubs. So when you're going around in your circle and you're just sort of fulfilling your role, I've had a hard time trying to get to that relationship building piece. So when we're sharing our thoughts, questions, and epiphanies, which is almost, it is similar, like there's a fine line, but just the language and the approach that we're taking feels like, okay, in order for us to really understand the big ideas of this novel and to understand each other, we actually need to work together. And we have to collaborate if any of us are going to get a rich understanding of what the story is really about. So we can, develop, those reading strategies, those writing skills, all of that skill building, but what can we do together to actually take us farther than any of us would be able to on our own? And so that's really why I had to move away from that. And plus what's happening now is, yes, we're digging deeper into the text, but we're also, broadening our perspectives, and not just because of what we're reading, but because of how other students and how their peers are reading the text as well. And those are two really important things that has really changed the way that, and really helped reinforce this choice and sticking to this choice as well.
I love the fact that what you're talking about so much emphasizes that reading is a social experience, and that it is a way for us to connect with each other. So I love how that kind of underlies your work and your shifts along the way toward that. So thanks for sharing that, George. Casey, let's move now to you about your reasons why.
Right. I was just thinking, I've had some revelations around language, because I've always kind of used the terms lit circles and book clubs interchangeably. I hadn't ever really seen them differently, because I had moved away from those sort of roles a long time ago, but I had still called them lit circles. And then some years I've called them book clubs and that kind of thing. So it's interesting to hear what people kind of view about that. But when we first started Lit Circles, over a decade ago, it was actually a pilot project. Our initial purpose was a pilot project in order to look at reading engagement in grade 9, specifically in grade 9 applied English at the time, which I find interesting, because oftentimes when I talk about book clubs or that aspect of social reading, the first question a lot of people always ask me are, but what do you do in your college and your applied level courses? And and I often say, well, I do that. We do the same thing in all of our courses, because all kids need those social opportunities to read and to learn socially. And so the first time that I started doing this, it was actually a huge disaster. I had no idea what I was doing, and the roles were a bit of a disaster. And it took quite a while to find a groove, I think, in doing things. But I think one of the things I learned was about the importance of teaching kids sort of the oral communication skills, and what does it look like, and what does it sound like to sit down and learn socially, and to have, like George said, like a common purpose together. And I think that's really where we started to shift, looking at our oral communication expectations as well, away from sort of the, we just did the presentation, to really focusing on those interpersonal skills as our main focus for oral communication within the classroom. And what we realized was that this type of learning benefits all students, that many of our students who maybe were very compliant in reading those whole class novels because they were motivated by grades or whatnot, they were doing it out of compliance and not out of investment in their reading and in their learning. And so that's when we started to make that shift to doing sort of that social learning with everybody. And we also recognize, obviously, that there's no, there's no one size fits all book for everybody. Even the idea of like, this is a grade 9 book versus this is a grade 10 book, and those labels that we sometimes put on text, we've become a lot more fluid in the books that we offer within courses, even from year to year, depending on the group of students that we have sitting in front of us. And obviously, like, our demographic in Oshawa has changed, over the last 15 to 20 years, and our books were just not representative, we're just not representative anymore in terms of diversity. So I think that the idea too, one thing we're looking at now, with the self-selected reading and growing as a reader, is looking at how we can have kids ask questions about how they build their book lists in class as well. Because we realized with book clubs or lit circles, that, if we were offering, one book by, say, an Indigenous author every year, that our kids opting out of that book every single year. And so how are we going to provide experiences for kids to choose books, but to also read books, to expand, their horizons in terms of the books that they're reading as well. So that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of looking at that. But yeah, a big shift for us was really thinking about that oral communication and that social learning, and how those expectations fit together within the classroom.
Casey, you touched on this idea about the book lists, and it sounds like you're getting students to kind of develop their own book list. Is that the case? Yeah.
Yeah. So I try not to make it so much of a random, like, just grab whatever you want to read. Like, it's more of a thinking about how are we gonna create a list, and we've started to create sort of grow as a reader graphics that look at different ways, in terms of, looking at different forms of text, or looking at, different authors from different backgrounds and that type of thing. And so students can think about, consciously how they're actually creating that experience for themselves.
I love that point you made earlier too, that this alternative approach just isn't reserved for a select few or a select type of student. And again, maybe it's allowing those other students, or those students who we may not typically think of right away, maybe that's drawing them back into reading. So anyway, thanks for sharing that, your reason why you're trying this out. Let's now check in again with Olivia around her reasons why she's taken on this approach. And again, there are a number of parts to that approach, Olivia, but again, especially thinking about your practice from a grade 7 and 8 when you've got them for a whole year, where most of us don't have that, and in some cases down to a quadmester where we only see them for even a quarter of a year. But I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I do absolutely feel very lucky to have the students for a full year. I think it's great to watch them grow over the course of that much time. But my biggest motivation for moving away from that whole class novel study was really the equity piece. I found that I could not incorporate diverse voices into the classroom as much as I would have liked to with the whole class novel study. It became very limited. And, you know, even in striving to incorporate new or different texts, I knew that not every student would see themselves or their interests reflected in the classroom. So I wanted to get away from that. And part of it as well is meeting students where they're at. So it's been a few years since I did a full class novel study, but the selections for what counts, you know, as Casey was saying, as a grade 7 or 8 book, I think leave a lot to be desired. And I feel like I can't genuinely, you know, in my school, present those books that we have in the building to a full group of diverse learners and say, like, this is what we're reading. So, you know, I want to meet students where they're at. If they're at the point where they're reading graphic novels, that's great. If they're at the point where they're consuming Rick Riordan, like it's Oxygen, also like awesome. And then, you know, if I have a student who wants to try reading Macbeth, go for it, right? Like, I just want to meet you where you're at. And then what's most beautiful to me, and something that I've seen happen a bit in implementing this process of choose something to read, is that reading can also involve failure. And a student might pick up a book, they might read a few pages and decide that it's boring, or decide that they don't like the author's voice, or decide that the diction is too elevated for them at this point. And, you know, if we're doing a full class novel study, things end at failure, right? There is no out for that student. Whereas if they're self-selecting their reading, they can put that book down and choose something that they will not feel as though they are failing, right? Something where they can be successful, and then maybe they come back to that book at another time in their reading journey. So that was really important to me, to have the opportunity for students to just, you know, feel successful in their reading journey as well. My big thing that I did not want to lose moving away from the whole class novel study was the collaborative piece, because I do feel, you know, when you're reading something as a class, that gives you an opportunity for collaboration. So I didn't want each student to be like a little island in the classroom. So, you know, it was important for me to build collaboration into the activities, alternate activities that I'm doing. So something that I've recently started trying out is a battle of the books. And this is a work in progress for me. But every couple of months, the students get a new sort of prompt. So the most recent prompt was a book or a piece that confronts the problem of racism. And they work in groups of 2 or 3 to read the book, and then they create like an episode of a podcast where they kind of talk about the book, they discuss the book in the context of that prompt or that social problem, that real life context. And then we share our podcasts with the grade 6, 7, and 8 classes at our school. And they vote on which book they want to read, right? So there's that competitive piece too, but it also gives everyone an opportunity to win at some point, because depending on what class is listening to the podcast and students in that room, they're going to choose something different, right? So that like leadership, I think, and that sharing a love of reading has been a big motivator for me.
Nice. Olivia, you brought a new insight for me. This idea that, well, you talked about failure, and I guess it's the idea that sometimes books fail us, right? Like they're not speaking to us. I'm not getting into it. I guess what I really love about that approach and that insight is that how you are articulating for your students that these are reasons why a book might fail us, and it's perfectly okay, where that would never be the case. Like when I was doing a whole class novel, right? Like, it's like, okay, I know you hate this, but let's plow through it anyway. But you're articulating all of those reasons why a book might fail us. So thank you for that. Let's now move to hear from Amanda's reasons why. So Amanda, I know when we were collaborating too, you had like all of these reasons that pulled you into this direction. So I'm going to turn it over to you to share that. So.
Yeah, there's a ton of reasons, and I think kind of everyone so far who's talked about their reasoning, everyone is right, basically, right? Like, I think there's this massive shift that's happening in education. And I think even if we think about where we are in the world, the last 20 months, there's been this huge kind of cultural shift in terms of people's awareness, whether it's, equity and inclusion, CRRP. And I think one of the greatest things that has come out of this cultural shift is the challenging of systems. And I'm going to say something that's controversial, so stay with me. Education as a system is incredibly oppressive, right? When we think about the barriers that exist in the very system that many of us work for. And so it's incredibly challenging to be a teacher who is committed to challenging these systems and yet still be very much bound to them to a certain degree, right? And so part of challenging even looking at the selection of books, right? There is an oppressive nature that exists as like you are the classroom authority, you are the teacher. As a department head, I carry a certain amount of authority in terms of the books I select. And if I'm selecting, canon classics because they've worked in the past, am I necessarily creating a just space for all of my students to feel represented, to feel seen, heard, and understood, right? And so part of my shift to kind of getting away from our typical books or even one novel is to move more towards to challenging those systems, right? Even when we think about the curriculum, I find that I'm a senior level English teacher, and I find that I have this conversation with senior level English teachers where even the curriculum is looked at in very much like a hierarchy, like where the novel is on top and like essay writing is on top, and like, you know what I mean? Like, oh my goodness, if a kid can't write an essay, like they're not going to do well, when really like we're not teaching students to be English lit majors, right? And I think as many of my colleagues have kind of talked about within even this space, part of our job is bringing a love for reading, and more than that, that relationship piece, right? As George mentioned, part of our role as a classroom teacher is to get students to feel empowered. And whether it's through like a lot of the talk about the roles in lit circles and moving away from that, I think the big thing that I'm kind of hearing even within this conversation is how can we provide those opportunities for students to be advocates for their own learning. And so when we provide those spaces by giving them roles or by allowing them to guide their own learning, we then help to break down some of those barriers where I am the authority and I tell you what to read, what to learn, right? And instead, it's about providing those opportunities. So it looks so different, right? And it is so different from probably everything that we are as teachers have experienced. But I think in doing this, we're really kind of shaking up the way that students learn. And I think if anything, it's just going to continue to foster that sense of empowerment within them. And so, part of my reasoning is to shake things up, but it also is to just further that commitment to equity and inclusion, right? And walking the walk and not just talking the talk. And so using my power and my, social location as best I can to reach students and to empower them.
Thanks, Amanda. And maybe, I guess what I love about this is that this disruption of practice sits in this larger disruption that needs to happen around the systems that often oppress students and take away their voice and power. And Tia Duke has a shout out for you in the chat too about, you know, speaking to this truth. So thank you so much for sharing that. We'll move now to Dan to talk about his reasons why. So welcome back, Dan, and I'll turn it over to you about your why.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. So in regards to my project, the bones of it really came forward in a discussion with one of my colleagues, Eve Hellman, last spring. And she had been teaching the grade 12 university English course at the time. She had titled it Expressions and Oppression, a first unit she did to review a lot of content with students. And the name alone interested me. So we got to talking about it, and that's kind of where this all blew up out of it. When we had the conversation, I had just finished reading James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. I had just finished reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And with those two being fresh in my mind, and Eve sharing the ideas she had for an introductory unit by using nonfiction to inform our students about stuff they may not be aware of, I kind of added on the idea of what if we compare two novels and have students do that comparative work for us to understand really differing developments from the 1960s and the way society was then and 50 years onwards. Has anything changed or failed to change? And then by an odd twist of fate, our board's English consultant, Aaron Doak, who I think is somewhere in the chat, so hi Aaron, sent an email to our board as a whole asking if any teachers wanted to get any nonfiction resources for their courses to kind of bring more nonfiction into our English curriculum, which there's a bit of a gap in that in our board. And so with all those opportunities presented, I jumped on it. We went with Baldwin and Coates and added in books by Jesmyn Ward and Michael Ondaatje as well to kind of open the door to a wider range of students. And the biggest reason I wanted to do this, why I wanted to develop this project beyond just educating my students about very real histories that impact them today, was to give my students a chance to see themselves in the literature they study. My home school is an inner city school in Ottawa. With the demographic we draw from, we have a huge number of Black Canadian students. We have a huge number of Southeast Asian students. And in what we had read traditionally over the years, neither of those groups was well represented, or not as well represented as I felt they should be. And so by using these four authors, we were able to, so to speak, hit a larger number of students with books they could connect with. We had gay Black males in James Baldwin. We had Black women in Jesmyn Ward. We had Southeast Asian authors in Michael Ondaatje with that unique Canadian perspective as well. And we had Ta-Nehisi Coates writing from a much more modern, much more sort of neoliberal perspective. And a lot of my students were able to then connect with that in a bunch of different ways. They were given a chance to have a blind date with each book to decide which one they wanted to use. And then they were able to pick one that they associated or connected with the most. And that, I think, is what I saw as a first success for the literature circle content here, where the students could pick one of those four books, is that my students were able to connect with them a lot more than they had with past literature circles that we had done. So they were able to make text-to-text connections. They were able to make text-to-world connections. They were able to learn about each other's lives and discussions about these novels, which a lot of them blew me away because, pardon me, a lot of them were students who traditionally weren't overly interested in English, but they were so passionate about what they were talking about. They were sharing their own experiences in some, inner city, low-income communities with their peers who didn't live there, able to understand each other a bit more that way. And beyond that, they were able to give insight into subtext that even I missed reading these. And I think that was the second really big success of the project is, I'm a straight white male who grew up in the suburbs. I can read about the stuff as much as I want. I can try to explore it as much as I can, but I'm never going to understand those realities to the same extent as my students. And they were able to open my eyes in discussions with them, in observations of the things they were talking about. And I was able to understand the books more. And even more importantly, I was able to understand my students more and build that stronger rapport, that stronger connection. And I think what helped with this project and what a really big success of the project is that the resources we use for it are very adaptable. They don't need to just fit into this one unit, so to speak. It can work with almost any book. We had a bunch of different roles where students looked at theme or the role of setting on each author, connecting the novels to other texts they had read or watched or seen or listened to, finding ways to connect issues to modern events. And those are just core features that we always want our students to explore, obviously. But by pairing those more traditional roles with more relevant novels, by bringing my students' own experiences, they were able to really connect to that a bit more. And I think that's what's the beauty of this project, this kind of idea of letting our students see themselves in the text, is they can make those connections and understandings quite a bit more. Now, I obviously did incorporate whole class study earlier in the semester, pardon me. My dog is having a little panic attack right here. The reason we did that whole class study was really just to give my students confidence in their own abilities to analyze the text they were reading. So we kind of scaffolded and built those skills throughout the course, but then they were eventually able to take on this role as a specialist in their own novel at the end, where they were able to teach their peers about it. And I think that was really key. That again, built those, sorry, I'm so sorry. That again,
we love that your daughter is part of our panel discussion. So
that's my dog, actually. That's my
your dog. So
yeah.
sorry, I thought it was, you said daughter. So anyway.
No. So by having my students though able to make those discussions and explain things to their peers, they were able to expand on that confidence, expand on that understanding of the novel in a way they previously may have not been able to. And I think that confidence building and that identification of themselves in the text is really the main reason why I wanted to do this project and why I would use a variation of it in the future.
Thanks, Daniel. I don't know if you recognize, but there was a word that came up a couple of times in your description, and it was about blowing things up. You had to blow up your practice, but then you were blown away by what you saw in your students. And part of it too, I think, was around something that Amanda talked about, was decentering the role of the teacher and just being open to what students are bringing rather than what we are imposing and giving them through the reading. So thanks for that. And I know you're up first again, so hopefully you can, check in with your puppy. And but we're going to hear from Degmo right now. She's just going to share about what's been out there around the chat, maybe about what's come up through Twitter. Degmo, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, you guys are making my job easy. You guys are checking in the chat, so that's great. That's a lot of people having the teacher be the facilitator instead of the person who's in front of the room and just the person who's giving the knowledge to the students, right? I hear about accountability as well. When students are given the choice, they can own the text. I remember in my recently when I gave students choices to look at their texts. A couple of students said that they weren't feeling the novels. So we had to tear up the list and have them contribute. We went to the library and had them look at some books and have them contribute to that list as well. And they ended up really loving the choices that they've selected, and it was wonderful. Sandra, I'm just thinking of the Twitter here. Sandra Snook says reading is a social experience, similar to what you said earlier, Brian, and then Deborah as well. Melanie White says labeling text as this is a grade 9 or a grade 10 is not just useful. It's not just useful or realistic. And sometimes we tend to do that, is have, this is a grade 9 text or grade 10 text. But just giving students that choice and that voice as well helps with the accountability later on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things I noted too, Daniel talked about this, and Casey touched on it too. This idea about that the work that they've been doing comes out of the collaboration that they've been doing with other teachers. So again, not all of us might be in that position where sometimes we have to go it alone. So I'm hoping that by hearing these voices from teachers who are trying this out, if you're feeling like you don't have that sense of collaboration, you've got some sense of where it could go if you're thinking about, as Daniel said, blow up your practice and try something else. We're already at our final question, and in working with the panelists, and when we were thinking about the question, we were thinking about, so again, this is great that we're doing it. It's great that we're offering these choices. It's great that we're getting kids into reading, but what does this look like as far as assessment? And maybe to touch on something that Amanda said earlier too, that let's not make this as some kind of hierarchy where, well, it's still going to be the Shakespeare play that matters that we're going to do the essay. So I'm going to invite each of the panelists now to talk about, so given this approach, what does assessment look like? And Dan, we'll start with you to talk about, again, how you bring in that aspect of assessment to also think about not only incorporating this approach, but also using it as a way to leverage students, the kinds of feedback that you can give them as far as your assessment practice. So I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely, thanks. As I mentioned before, this is very much a work in progress still, and I've only taught this unit one time. So I think I'm going to preface this by saying none of what I'm going to say is breaking the mold or is very, overly insightful, but that's the next step, is trying to find more creative ways, more, accessible ways of implementing effective assessment. So what I did appreciate when I was creating this unit, and what my department had mentioned as well, was that the simplicity of this unit is really what helped it. There's no reinventing of the wheel in the way that we assess things. We were able to use assessment formats we'd used in the past, just instead we offered a bit more choice in the method of that assessment. So throughout the course, we still did a lot of the usual things. Students were still writing and reading and creating media projects and using all those core skills and hitting all elements of the curriculum, but they were able to do that with a bit more creativity, a bit more ownership of how they would address that. So what the literature circles really allowed my students to do was to look at key identifiers: theme, setting, contemporary connection, analyzing quotes, and then leading discussions, but in their own way. So I used very general rubrics in this regard. There was ones that had reading and writing attached to them, and then an optional media expectation attached to it as well. And what this gave my students a chance to do was vary up the ways that they presented their work to their groups, not kept the monotony from building too much. It allowed them to have a bit more excitement and interest between, meetings, so to speak, of their lit circles, because there was no one right way of presenting your arguments or your information to your group. So I had some students, would write out a long response and chose to read it out loud to their peers. Some recorded a creative video that they had made at home. Someone made a song to describe the setting of Chicago and its impact on James Baldwin when writing The Fire Next Time. There was all these unique ways that students were able to use their own skills. And then by having that more general rubric, that were they able to understand key concepts? Were they able to effectively communicate that? Was there a media project? If so, did they, make it in a cohesive and very clear way? That allowed my students that opportunity to have that flexibility in their learning. On top of that, they had discussions with me where I would filter around each group. I would observe the discussions they had and take notes on it. And all of that allowed me to kind of triangulate a bit more information about where their learning was at. They also completed a peer assessment at the end of each of their meetings to kind of, I could see, how were students engaged when I wasn't right there, when I wasn't watching what was happening. And so all of that, again, allowed me to just triangulate and really reinforce my students' learning and see where the gaps still were. I also want to address really quickly the fact that, yes, this is a literature circle. Yes, it's nothing new, nothing groundbreaking. But as I mentioned before, it's the first step in moving away from that whole class learning. It's the first step in giving my students that chance to take ownership of their own topics of study, of the way they learn and develop those English skills, because as I think one of the other panelists mentioned, they're not all going to be English majors. They're not all going to be lit majors. And it's important that we recognize that even in a grade 12 university English course, they're going to go in a bunch of different ways. So what we need to make sure is, can they effectively communicate? Can we maybe instill a love of reading or learning just a little bit, just enough to carry them forward so they can continue growing as individuals and as citizens? So that's kind of what the central theme of all of what I'm talking about here is. There's nothing that new. It's all just about using the tools you have for assessment and adapting them to the subject, because really it's the subject specific focus that I changed in my project here, not the whole assessment format per se.
Thanks, Dan. And I love how you're revealing that this is a journey. Like this is you you know, you're still on your way to finding and working your way through this. So thanks so much for sharing that. In the chat, Melanie White shared about, you know, some idea around, again, that shift around how we use assessment tools and where we go with that. So she's included a link there, so you might want to check that out. But right now, we'll turn it over to Olivia. Olivia, what does assessment look like for when you're working with students with this different approach?
Yeah, I, like Dan, will preface my answer with an acknowledgement that sometimes, often, I think, when we're trying new things in the classroom, the curriculum piece, the planning piece, that's the fun part, and the assessment is the scary part, right? Because there is, for better or worse, this drive to collect data, right? And it's difficult, right? And it's scary. And that's, for me, something that I always feel like is a bit of taking a leap, right? So, but you know, you said, I think it was Brian, you said earlier that there is no novel study in the curriculum, right? There is no Shakespeare in the curriculum. And it's funny, you know, at the point where I get my students, you know, when I tell them this, they're shocked. What do you mean there's no novel study in the curriculum? I'm like, well, let's look at those documents, right? Like, we don't have to do this. Here's what you're being assessed on, right? Here's what the curriculum is asking you to achieve by the end of grade 7 or the end of grade 8. And they're like, whoa, right? It's awesome. So aside from it being, you know, I think a challenge to develop assessment tools, or assessment methods that fit everyone choosing their own book or multiple books in a classroom. You know, everyone in my class reads something different. And, you know, I've been asked, does assessment get unwieldy? Is it impossible? And I'm like, no, not always. It's a little chaotic, but it's fun, right? And it's fine. You know, one of the things that I do is I always go back to those overall expectations, and they're very open-ended. They're so good for allowing self-selected reading to take place. I try to build in choice around the way that students show their learning. And then, you know, using sort of low stakes methods to have students talking about and representing their learning as well. So one of the things that happens in my classroom is we have a featured reads wall, and every 2 weeks a student is responsible for selecting like 3 to 5 texts that go up on the wall for 2 weeks. And I model it first because, you know, expectations need to be clear. What is it that you're expected to do here? It's not just about putting your text up on the wall. So this year, what I did was I put 3 books to start. The new Borders graphic novel from Thomas King, Elatsoe by Darcy Little Badger, and What the Eagles See by Eldon Yellowhorn, and just checking my notes, Kathy Lowinger. So these are 3 texts by Indigenous authors. And so I summarized each book for the students. And if they're doing that, that's accessible, right? I made connections between the 3 pieces. That's accessible, right? That's in our curriculum. And then I talked about, you know, using my speaking strategies and my oral communication strategies, my purpose, my clarity, my coherence. I talked about what I loved about each of those books and why I was putting it on the featured reads wall, and that's accessible, right? So these low stakes moments where students get to talk about what they love and share what they love with their peers, provide opportunities for real data collection, right? And real evidence-based assessment. And, you know, it's fun because the books never stay on the wall for long. They're always gone, right? Because the students are passing them around. And I think, you know, what it boils down to for me is that, you know, choice, because if we're offering flexible reading, then we have to be offering flexible assessment as well. And that's really sort of where I'm at, but it's still a work in progress for me.
Yeah. I love, it's something that Dan talked about too, but I think too, what you're getting at is that we have been so steeped in it. Well, maybe not you, but maybe I was really so steeped in, I had to collect products in order to have demonstrations of learning. And you're telling us like, it doesn't have to be. So that shift is about listening to what kids are saying, having conversations with them, and using that as relevant pieces to work with as far as assessment. Olivia, before we get to George, the other thing that we can put on that list that's not in the curriculum is the five paragraph essay. So let's
So true.
let's address that too. Anyway, George, let's talk about you and what you're thinking around in terms of assessment.
Yeah, so I'm working out some ideas right now, and something that I'm going to pilot this semester after the book clubs. And it really got me thinking about what kind of data am I looking for? Like, what is the kind of data that I'm hoping to collect through this work? And so I think about the purpose of assessment, and for me, it's designed to validate and honor the way students read and their identities, and the ways that they express their identities, and the ways that they construct knowledge. And so one thing that I'm working on and trying to figure out, but it's going to be co-designed with my students, is I like this idea of doing an exit interview with them. And so some of the considerations will include, will it be like a one-on-one? Will it be a group exit interview with their book club members? And that final conversation piece that really is centered around metacognition and ultimately what they've learned about themselves and each other as a result of this process. Going back to that first question, how much can you learn about others from reading, but also what have you learned about yourself and the world around you? And so, you know, those daily book club activities are really opportunities for them to collect their own evidence, to talk and share what they learned. So I can ask them a question like, what has been your pivotal learning experience? Was it the work we did in looking at craft? Was it that informal conversation that you had on Monday? Was it the hexagonal thinking piece? Was when we worked to unpack power and privilege on Wednesday, or we formulated some inquiry questions? Or was it through adapting a passage into a film and you storyboarded it and started to put it all together? What has been your pivotal learning experience? And someone asked earlier on in the chat, what is the teacher doing throughout those activities? And essentially what I'm doing is through those observations and conversations, in essence, I'm helping them to curate what it is that they plan to talk about, and helping them to develop the language around how they're going to talk about it and what their learning what their learning became and looked like for them. So I can go around and say, wow, you really captured this relationship between these two characters through this hexagonal thinking here. Tell me more about that. And so when they get to the assessment piece, that exit interview, they can go back to the conversation we had. Now, hopefully they've worked on it a little bit more. They've developed their thinking a little bit about it further since that conversation. And that could be in part of that pivotal learning experience that they want to share. So that's definitely something that I want to try out. But I also feel like what they could do is in a way to synthesize or consolidate their learning, they could create a product and share that in the exit interview if they wanted to, right? As that this is how I wanted to consolidate my thinking, and this is what I want to share with you. And that can take on any form, right? And we've been working on looking at different forms throughout the course, so they can go back and take a look at something they've produced earlier or something they wanted to take another chance at. So I like the idea of exit interviews. I like the idea that there's so much flexibility in how they look. And I like that you can have a discussion with your students as to how you want that structure to be. And they get to have choice in deciding not only what the structure of that interview is like, but how they're going to express their learning and what exactly it is that they're going to pull from those book club activities and meetings to show their best learning or that most pivotal learning. And I think for me, that's the kind of data that I'm looking for. And I think would be the best and most accurate representation of their abilities and demonstrating the overall expectations that are built into those activities. And that's how I ensure validity in the work that I'm doing in terms of aligning those overall expectations.
I love how part of that, I think what I'm hearing for you is that, I mean, we are sort of bound by this system where we do have to like gather evidence and report on stuff through assessment. But I think something also key in what you're talking about is about the students' growth. And I wish we had, or I hope that we can take more opportunities to talk about students' growth rather than just achievement, because I think that's so much more of a human thing to do, to talk about their growth rather than just how, you know, what it looks like in a number as a code or what it looks like in a report card comment. So thanks for that, George. Amanda, we're back again, and so interested in how you are sorting out what assessment looks like with your approaches that you're taking.
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback off of the conversation that just took place about student growth, I think it's so important to recognize the last 20 months, what it's done to everyone, right? Like not just to teachers, but to students, right? And I don't know if I'm the only one, I cannot be the only one who's experienced this, but students have changed. There's been so much that has affected them and their mental health. And part of our role is not just, to evaluate their academic success, but to teach the whole child. And in part of teaching the whole child, it's so important to recognize the toll that the last 20 months has taken on mental health, right? And I think when we look at our curriculum and we look at, the big areas, at least for me, I can kind of break it down into two big areas. So we have literacy, right? Reading, writing, basic literate skill. Like, are you literate? Can you walk away from English programming being a literate person, right? Those skills are so important. And I think our curriculum speaks to that. And what I would argue beyond those skills are critical thinking and media consumption and being media literate. So much of the way that students consume information is in this digital era. And I think our curriculum lends itself so well to be able to meet those students' needs. So in terms of how are you getting your information? Where is it coming from? Who's the authority on it, things like that. Like, I think when we think about teaching from that lens, we can understand that our job is more than, can you write that 5-paragraph essay? Can I give you a set of comprehension questions, and can you understand what you're reading? Like, that stuff is it's definitely important, but in terms of, taking a different approach to teaching, I think it's just as important to take a different approach to assessment and evaluation. And one of my practices, very similar to everyone else who's spoken so far, in terms of looking at those overall expectations and allowing those to kind of guide where the assessment comes from. One practice that I've been doing now for the last 5-6 years is spending quite a bit of time and explaining curriculum to my students and explaining the achievement chart to my students and having them actually co-construct a success criteria and understanding what it looks like to meet expectations, the expectations of reading, the expectations of writing, of media studies, of oral communication, and what it looks like to go above and beyond. And I found that in doing that, not only did it allow students to feel empowered in their learning and advocate, but my metacognitive assessments were so much more authentic. It was so much more than like, I spent 30 minutes on this and like, I use these skills. And they're just like, taking language from the rubric and being like, I was thorough, right? And it just allows for a more authentic assessment of themselves. And that's the skill that we all want them to have, right? Can you approach a task in life and realize, like, are you doing a good job or are you going above and beyond, right? And that's empowering those students. So I would really encourage everyone here, everyone listening, to really kind of think about how you can change your approach to that classic assessment and evaluation, right? To get students involved in their own learning, and so that they understand exactly what skills are needed. So that in that way, when we are having these conversations about, okay, like let's look at all of these, short stories, let's think about identity, let's think about what that looks like. Okay, friends, how can we show or demonstrate our learning of these concepts? What do you think is the best way to do that? And you might have students say things like, okay, well, we're talking about identity. I'd like to do like a mind map of my identity. Cool. I'd like to do a rant or a spoken word about my identity. Cool. I'd like to do a report or a video of what it's like to be me. Cool. Look at that. Like they are literally differentiating themselves, right? Because we've armed them with the proper language and the tools to be able to assess themselves. And again, like, isn't that why we're all here, right? To empower our students so that when they leave us, which they all do, they go off into the world as so much more just better critical thinkers, right? That they're able to then consume the information around them, and they have those media skills, and they are media literate, so that when they get to these spaces where their voices are heard, it's more genuine, and it is a reflection of who they are, and they're able to demonstrate their own power.
And I just want to draw a thread to what you talked to us earlier too, about how you are shifting that power to the students by giving them the knowledge and skills and making that transparent. So that can also apply to assessment as well. So thanks. Casey, I know you talked earlier on in the last round, so I feel like I've had this grand tour of a bunch of other classrooms to come back to yours. So I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about how you are seeing assessment with your approach.
Yeah, I just saw somebody posted about gradeless. Yeah, so I am gradeless in my classroom. My students don't get grades on anything unless I have to give them. So at midterm and final grades. So I wanted to make a couple points. I have a lot. I love assessment, so I have a lot to say, but I'll try and keep it concise. When it comes to reading, I think one thing that's important to think about is that the reading and the thinking about reading is the learning. And it is the journey for students. I think for a long time, and people have already mentioned about product assessments and that kind of thing. You can have students read books and not do a product at the end. That's okay. Not that, and I mean, lots of people have talked about lots of opportunities for good, authentic, and interesting learning that do involve products. So I don't think it's an either or, but I think I just think sometimes people are hesitant to really kind of go down that route. And so one thing I've thought a lot about in recent years is, how do I capture that student thinking that's going to allow me to help them progress in their learning and their skills without that product at the end. And so I do a lot of conferencing, and I keep a fairly comprehensive spreadsheet that students have access to, where we talk about what they're doing in their what they're thinking about in their reading. And often I start those conferences with what's worth talking about in what you're reading right now. So it starts with them choosing what part of their book or whatever media text they're invested in. It starts with them. And then I kind of go from there and see what their strengths are, and then where I could nudge them a little bit more to think about some different things. I also do spiderweb assessments of their small group discussions. So I almost transcribe their entire discussions, which is really interesting after, because sometimes they don't even remember that they said certain amazing things in their discussions, and we can come back and talk about those after and connect them to other things. So I've got that record of things that were said in their discussions that they don't necessarily have to put into a product after. And I think it's really important that when it comes to evaluation, people have mentioned co-construction of criteria already. So that's important, but also thinking about the wording of our criteria. And if we're telling students that we value social learning, that needs to be reflected in our assessment as well. So we cannot say, I want you to learn collaboratively, but then I'm going to give you this independent assessment of how you read on your own after, and that's what matters. And so how we build, I talk to students a lot about the language that we use in our success criteria. So, you know, instead of I can do this in my reading, it might look like something like, you know, I can build off others' ideas in order to help me reshape my thinking about what I'm reading. And so when we sort of reframe what success looks like, it can help us leverage, and, you know, it can often it helps us to pull in certain skills that we may have been missing in students before. And since we've mentioned a lot about what's not in the curriculum, like 5-paragraph essays, I like to talk about what is in our curriculum. Very first expectation, students will select, right? Self-selected reading is right in the curriculum. Every single strand has a metacognition expectation, an overall metacognition expectation. It's a central part of our English curriculum. So my students, I have, you know, usually 9 or 10 learning goals for my class. A few of them have to do with reading. And so they reflect throughout the course on how they are meeting those learning goals, which could look very different for different students. And then at the end, when we either do our grade interviews or their learning stories at the end, they're able to pull in the evidence that they've shown in terms of working towards those particular goals. And I just wanted to address, somebody had talked about preparing them, you know, for future and things, you know, things that they might not be as interested in reading and that type of thing. And it is my personal stance that we should not be preparing students for the bad pedagogy that they may face in the future. A lot of the learning that I've done have come from post-secondary institutions and professors who are also starting to change their practice around assessment. So it's happening at all levels, right? And our students are our students right now. And I think we need to look at what they need right now in this moment in time. And, you know, we need to have some faith that if we give them what they need now and we let them see what success looks like now, then they'll be able to tackle certain challenges better in the future. So that's kind of always been my position on that. I think I said everything I wanted to say there.
Thanks, Casey. And thanks for taking us back to, there are things in that curriculum that we may have overlooked, but there are so many things in there that give us the leverage to do this kind of work. So thanks for bringing us back to that as well.
Yeah, Pointless by Sarah Zerwin is something that I've used a lot. That book is phenomenal in terms of framing how students reflect on their own learning, for sure.
Good. Thank you. Thanks. We're a bit over time and we are going to quickly wrap up, but I do want to touch on a comment that Navdeep left in the chat about how encouraging this was. So again, thank you to all the panelists for, again, passing on your expertise, your knowledge, and, you know, giving some further thoughts of where and what is possible. So I'm going to turn things back now to Mercy to quickly wrap us up for today.
Wow, that was fantastic. I have so many ideas. And thank you so much to our panelists and of course our guests for being here today. I just want to summarize some of the points that stuck with me, and I'm sure some of you may have some of your own points to add to this. So Amanda Gonsalves, Unlit Circles encourages accessibility within literature studies. Students feel seen, heard, and understood, and it really shifts the teacher's role as someone that empowers students to challenge those systems through the text selection in the classroom, and they can advocate for their own learning, which in doing so, during the assessment piece, students can have more genuine and authentic metacognitive assessments. Casey Hackett, also in the same sort of line, we have a better understanding of the positionality of the teacher, which is no longer the director of the learning, but as a facilitator of that process. Dan Begg Beg, sorry. I love the idea of blow up your practice and just collaborate with your colleagues and try something new, just to be more responsive of student learning. George Janetas talks about navigating away from the class novel, introducing book clubs, and instead of lit circles, and really helping students to curate assessment examples throughout the entire learning process, so that at the end, in the final sort of assessment, they do have those creations to pull from that aligns with their thinking and the expectations for the course. Olivia Pellegrino talks about the reading challenges throughout the course, which piques student interest and engagement through gamification, which is really interesting and fun with charts and visuals of rewards, and students get to challenge one another. And I really liked the Battle of the Books, which thematically addresses various social issues in small groups and create a podcast episode near the end to discuss those themes in larger contexts. So this promotes leadership and a love of reading among our students. Thank you. And I look forward to our upcoming events, especially in the winter and spring, and hopefully a conference in the summer. Check out our website at elanontario.com and follow us on Twitter at elanontario if you're on social media. That's it for me. Thank you, everyone. Have a great Sunday afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.